Hello everyone. SIMMI Foundation is a non-governmental organization that aims to work for the upliftment and betterment of the society. They work on creating awareness about environmental and social issues through educational seminars and interactive sessions. They provide internship proposal for the university or for college since 2021-2022. They have various departments like content, marketing, domestic affairs, fundraising, volunteering, international affairs, and many more other departments like mass media and journalism, graphic design, social media, web development, campus ambassador, and human resources. So the topic for today would be Leonty's paradox, which was given by Vasily Leonty. So let's move on to the introduction. On the basis of Heckscher-Ohlin factor proportions model, one would expect capital-abundant US to be an exporter of capital-intensive goods and an importer of labor-intensive goods. But for 25 years after World War II, this was surprisingly not the case in US. In a famous study published in 1953, Vasily Leonty, a winner of Nobel Prize in 1973, found that US exports were less capital intensive than US imports. This result is known as Leonty paradox. It is the single biggest piece of evidence against the factor proportion theory. Later studies, however, pointed to the disappearance of Leonty paradox by early 1970s. Following are some of the well-known explanations of Leonty paradox. These are all practical explanations on basis of empirical evidence. The first one is the innovations advantage in US. Perhaps the most plausible explanation is that US had a special advantage in producing new product or goods made with innovative technologies like aircrafts and sophisticated computer chips. Such products may well be less capital intensive than products whose technology has had time to mature to become suitable for mass production techniques. Thus, US may be exporting goods that heavily use skilled and innovative entrepreneurship, while importing heavy manufacturers such as automobiles that use large amount of capital. The second one is US tariff structure. Opening of trade increases the real return of the abundant factor, that is capital in US, and decreases the real return of the scarce factor, that is labor in the US. This is called as the Samuelson-Stopler theorem. So labor is expected to be more protectionist in the US, which high tariff on the imports of relatively labor-intensive goods. This would make the import bundle more capital intensive and explain the Leonty paradox. The third one would be the Demar Reversal. This exists when demand conditions are considerably different across countries, such as each country relatively prefers the goods made with its physical abundant factor called own intensity preference. For example, the US demand for capital intensive goods bids up the price of those goods until the US comparative advantage lies in labor intensive goods. However, this implies that demand within the US for labor intensive goods would be low, and therefore US wages would also be low. This isn't true in reality. The fourth one is factor intensity reversal. A factor intensity reversal exists when a good is produced in one country by relatively capital intensive method, but is produced in another country by relatively labor intensive methods. In this case, the HO theorem can't obviously be valid in both the countries. So while US import goods might have been produced labor intensively overseas, the production process of these goods in the US was relatively capital intensive. Hence the paradox. However, empirical evidence is not very clear on the extent to which reversal exists. So the fifth one would be different skill levels of labor. There are actually many different kinds and qualities of labor. That is, labor is not homogeneous. David Keesing in 1966 divided labor into 8 different categories in decreasing order of skills. He then found that US exports had a higher proportion of the most skilled category 1 workers, and that US import competing industries had a higher portion of least skilled categories, that is 8 workers. Perhaps the US is skilled labor abundant and unskilled labor is scarce. And if each type of labor skill is considered a different factor, then the US trade pattern actually confines to the HO theorem. The Leonty paradox therefore occurred because of a two-factor model rather than adopting such a realistic multiple-factor model. The sixth one is natural resources as a third factor. This explanation was also considered a two-factor test as too restrictive to test the empirical validity of the HO theorem. Taking natural resources as a third factor, it argues that many of the import competing goods labeled as capital intensive were really natural resource intensive. With US being relatively scarce in natural resources, there is really no paradox with HO theorem. However, empirical evidence is uncertain about the relative importance of this explanation. Overall, with conflicting evidence, empirical evidence on HO theorem remains unclear or non-conclusive. So that's all about the Leontief paradox. Thank you so much.